Hello, everybody. Welcome to Lit Fic on a Mighty Blaze. I am Bo Ellis. I am filling in for Caroline Leavitt on this episode. So, thank you all for joining us today. A Mighty Blaze is an organization that was started in 2020 when COVID sort of ruined the normal book tours that authors did. A Mighty Blaze stepped in to really help promote authors, and now with our much more streaming friendly world, we are still here to make sure that you hear about authors from all over and get the opportunity. And Martha Ann Toll is our guest today, the author of The Three Muses. Cover here, it's very beautiful. It is an amazing book. It is a love story that enthralls a tale of Holocaust survival venturing through memory, trauma, and identity while raising the curtain on the unforgiving discipline of ballet. Thank you so much for being here, Martha. My first question for you is, I feel like authors are often haunted by things, and that is why we choose to write. So what was haunting you when you wrote about the Three Muses?
I love that question. First, I want to say thank you, Bo. I'm really excited to be talking to you and to Caroline as well. I'm so happy to be on your show. And I have my own book too. I actually dropped the word "the" along the way, so it's called
Oh, wow.
Three Muses because I wanted people to get right into the story. So I grew up in a very secular Jewish family. And even so, you can't avoid the Holocaust. Excuse me. As a Jewish person, I'm related to Holocaust survivors. I had friends whose parents were Holocaust survivors. And as I started to hear their stories growing up, I did become haunted, increasingly haunted. Partly as I got older, I began to see how close the Holocaust was to my own life. I mean, it's very, very recent history. And conversely, we are now seeing the last generation of people who will know Holocaust survivors because most of them are gone. And it's really important to tell this story.
Yes, absolutely. And I know that the title Three Muses is from Greek myth. So how did that tie in to this story?
So I had this idea about a Holocaust survivor for a while. And I actually was on this kind of random Google search looking for a framework for a novel. And I stumbled into this tradition that comes from the Greek island of Boeotia, which apparently had a tradition of three muses. When we're growing up and go to school, we hear about nine muses. This particular tradition has only three, and they are song, discipline, and memory. And when I heard that, it was a bit like lightning striking. And I can go on and talk about how they connect with the book, but I'm going to wait and see if that's a good time for me to talk about that now.
Yeah, I think that would be excellent to continue to talk about that because it is always amazing when, as an author, you get those like, wow, this actually really works. Like, this really connects with me in the story that I'm trying to tell. So I think that would be like,
So once again, the three muses are song, discipline, and memory. So my Holocaust survivor was called Yanko as a young boy, and his family is taken off. He has a very regular life in Mainz, Germany, but when Hitler comes to power, his family is destroyed and taken to a concentration camp, and his mother is standing with him as an 11-year-old boy. She's holding his baby brother in her arms, and she realizes she can maybe save his life by telling the SS officer who's carrying a big rifle that Yanko can sing. So he sings for the SS officer, and his life is saved by being taken out of line to the gas chamber and singing for the commandant of this camp where his mother and brother were murdered. He sings as sort of private entertainment for the commandant and his officers throughout the war. And when he is liberated, he eventually makes his way to America, very damaged because he survived, but he lost his whole family, and he is haunted by music. So music is both the means to his survival, but also associated with the murder of his family. And he falls in love with a ballerina, and the ballerina is loosely associated with discipline. Her name as a child was Catherine Silman, and when she grows up, she's given a fake Russian name of Katya Simonova. And of course, a ballerina is nothing without music. So here is Yanko, who is now called John in America. John falls in love with Katya Simonova and her work is associated with the most traumatic part of his life. Also, unbeknownst to John, Katya is involved in an abusive relationship with her choreographer, Boris Yanikov. Memory comes into all of them because both characters are haunted by memory, and because memory is really the wellspring from which we all write. And it's also the way that Jewish people have survived through history, basically retelling our collective memory. We're not people who build buildings or make cathedrals. So our collective memory is very important.
Yes. And that struggle between identity and holding on to it. Is that part of why both characters have their names changed in this? Because, names are such an integral part of our identity. They're what our parents gave to us. Is that what you were thinking along those lines when both characters had? Mm-hmm.
It's such a good question. I mean, their names have different metaphorical meanings. John's chooses his name, and he has this concept that everybody in America is named John. So if he's named John, he'll just fit in right away. And he chooses the last name of Curtin because he wants to drop a curtain from his past. But the person who spells it for him doesn't speak English, and so his name is spelled wrong, Curtin. And so in John's case, it's a choice to try to stamp out memory, to try to start a new life, which of course he can't really do because he's been too traumatized and too imprinted with his childhood horrors. Catherine, on the other hand, who becomes Katya and is Katya in most of the novel, that wasn't her choice. It never occurred to her to change her name. Her choreographer gives her that name, and it causes a lot of pressure for her because now she has this big, elegant Russian name, and she feels the need to step into that and suffers from some imposter syndrome as she becomes a prima ballerina. Is she worthy of this name? And what can she do to fulfill the name? So there are different sort of metaphorical references for both of them.
Mm-hmm. And it's fascinating to see how, John is making a choice, Katya is not making a choice. And, how does that affect how they feel about that?
Exactly,
Mm-hmm.
exactly.
And definitely Katya being a ballerina is so fascinating. What about ballet really drew you in to include it so heavily in this novel?
So I have loved ballet from the time I was a little girl. I probably took my first class when I was about 4. And my mother saw my interest. I grew up in suburban Philadelphia. And so she put me into a ballet class that was at a professional ballet company, which was then called the Pennsylvania Ballet. They're now known as the Philadelphia Ballet. And I just loved it. I loved it. I took a lot of classes. And when I hit about 11, 12, 13, the school was really clear that I had not a shred of talent, not the right body, not good feet, all the things that you need if you want to be a ballerina. And so they made that really clear. So I didn't really continue after about age 13 or 14. I mean, I did take random classes now and then.
Mm-hmm.
But what was really extraordinary about this ballet school was that the professional company was often rehearsing when I would come into class, and I could not get enough of watching them rehearse. I was just transfixed.
Mm-hmm.
I loved it. And I tried to transmit some of that love of watching the rehearsals to Katya as she is a little girl coming to ballet school to learn how to dance.
No. And I was wondering if the sort of rejection from ballet, it can be a little painful, as most of us, myself included, who've tried ballet, have realized or have been forcibly told that we're not quite what the industry is looking for. Did that pain ever influence your love for it? Is that part of why you brought in, because ballet is associated with, it's a harsh discipline. Is that what you kind of wanted to reflect as well?
It's very harsh discipline, and injury rate is incredible, and physical pain is endemic. I mean, I can say that at age 12, this felt like an absolute epic failure. I was young, I think, to get that level of clear adults who I admired and who I spent time with saying, basically, you're no good. You can't try out for the Nutcracker. You can't run around with a mouse head on your head. All my classmates were doing that. So it was really challenging. I mean, I think as an adult now, I know that I benefited from having that level of failure. I think failure is part of human existence. It's part of what we do. And while I have the mic here, I assume we have a lot of writers on this show. It's endemic to writing land. I mean, failure is not a good word. Rejection is probably better, but rejection is the norm in writing. It's terribly difficult to get published. And so it's something that I was dealing with as a young child. And I think it has helped me along in all the rejections that I have received as a writer.
Yes. Rejection, I think sometimes failure is a good word, because sometimes it does take absolutely falling on your face to be like, well, we're going to do something different next time, even though it hurts so very, very much.
Well, I think the falling on your face, it's less about falling on your face and more about getting up. The getting up part is just the thing that we have to learn how to do, and it's really important. And the older I get, the more comfortable I am with talking about this, because there's nobody who doesn't experience this. We're just not always so open about it.
Yes. No, and I think that is an amazing thing, is being willing to talk about it. A lot of people want to hide it because they think it maybe diminishes their accomplishments if we all know how many times it took. But I think that's really the best part, because then, like we said, there's nobody who hasn't failed. So everybody, when you see just these people who only show their success, it feels like they're so distant from you. But really,
yeah. And it makes it seem impossible. And, so many, quote, famous, successful people became that way because they had an epic fail in something earlier, and they changed ideas, changed jobs, changed fields. But it doesn't have to be epic. I just think every day we live in a world with a lot of challenges, and there are always going to be people out there who do what we do better, and it's just part of life. And it's, I think, as I said, the picking yourself up is the most important part.
Absolutely. And also, speaking of career changes, I know you were a book critic for a really long time. So how did it feel to be on kind of the other side of the books this time?
So I started writing novels in the early aughts, like around 2000, 2001-ish, something like that. And I had the anomalous experience of getting a series of very excellent literary agents in New York for different novels that I wrote, and none of them sold any of those to a publisher. So it went on for years and years and years. And it does make you feel a little loony. For all you writers out there, you're not loony. This is what happens. And I always quote Anne Enright, who won the Booker Prize a bunch of years ago. She's a beautiful Irish writer. And I heard her speak, and she said, if you're talking to a debut novelist, it's usually their 16th novel. So that's kind of what it was for me. But along the way, I'm like, I'm reading so much, and I love what I read. And maybe I should start reviewing books, because I would love to share that with the world. So I got started at the organizing meeting of a wonderful publication we have here in Washington, which is online, so you can access it anywhere. It's called the Washington Independent Review of Books. And they needed writers, and so they gave me my start, which I totally appreciate. And I will say it was a tremendous boon to my spirits to have a byline. I was so happy to be getting published. And very shortly, I realized I had something of a platform to bring books to people and audiences and readers who might not be able to find these books. So I kind of started looking for books from smaller presses, from lesser known authors, people of color, women. And so it's turned out to be just a great love of mine to share books with the public. And so is I guess what wanted the short answer to your question. I was writing fiction for a long time, and nothing was happening. So this was a way to kind of try a different style of writing that helped a lot.
And I believe this is Caroline Leavitt commenting from our Mighty Blaze account, but she said, I love that Martha said if you talk to a debut writer, they debuted is usually their 16th novel. Thanks for reminding us of this. And I think it's so true because, so many people are beautiful, brilliant, talented writing that we just don't get to see. And I think your advocacy, and especially bringing to light those authors that often get ignored, women, people of color, like you were saying, is so important. And what really made you realize that was something you definitely wanted to do with your book critic job as well?
Thank you. I'm going to answer that in 1 sec. I just want to thank
Yes.
Caroline because the last time I heard her speak, she herself spoke about this issue of the challenges once you're published, of getting published again. And I was in a small audience and it made a huge impact on me. I thought, wow, a writer who's as excellent and as experienced as Caroline's going to talk about this. I need to file that and remember that this happened. This is part of writing. And I like the advice that the best thing you can do as a writer is try to get 100 rejections a year, and that rejection is what's normal. So actually, my professional career, I'm trained as a lawyer. I worked in social justice for over 20 years, and I had a terrific job running a small family philanthropy, not my family. I was the staff person, but I represented this family. And my job was to give away money that they earned on a corpus of money. And we were focusing on housing and homelessness, racial justice, and criminal justice. And you cannot be in those fields and you cannot meet people who are doing this amazing advocacy work without realizing how hurting our world is. I mean, you don't have to have a job like that to know that, but it definitely brought me deep inside it. And so I think I'm wired that way. And I also think my professional experience helped me to be wired that way. But I was probably already wired that way a bit. So
no, and that's an amazing series of careers, I would have to say. It seems like, and it's amazing that you've kept just that high level of compassion and willingness to extend that to all your fellow man, because I think we could always use more compassionate people in the world, I will say.
Well, I'm not going to argue with that, but I also want to say part of my opinion here is that we're as readers, we are just missing so much if we only read, what we're familiar with. So I feel so greatly enriched. I mean, by what I have been able to read, by what I have been able to share. I've learned so much. I mean, it's our loss if we don't have those books. So it's my pleasure, but it's also enriching for everybody. So I feel I really care about that.
No, and that is an amazing point, because you are so correct that when we ignore these stories, whether consciously or just because no one thinks to tell us we should seek them out, we are missing out on like 90% of the world. And that's crazy to think that so many people stay in their little bubble because they may not even realize that they're in a bubble.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. And we also do have an audience question, I think from Caroline as well, but she says, I'm always really interested in the first sentences because I think so many of the seeds of meaning in a novel start right there. Yours is, he had no bearings in Paris. Why does that line resonate so much?
I have to think about that. So I definitely rewrote the first part of the book a few thousand times, but I will tell you that that sentence has been there from the beginning. And I think so. The book opens with John. He's now in the United States. He's become a psychiatrist. He's at a professional meeting of mental health professionals in Paris when the book opens. And I liked the idea that he had no bearings because I felt that it was somewhat emblematic of his life. I mean, he had no bearings when he came to the United States as a 15 or 16-year-old with no family, no English. And I also, last night at my launch of Politics and Prose, I quoted the writer Mary Kay Zarovlev, who talks about how your first page, your first chapter should have the DNA of the whole novel. And in a way that it says quite a bit about him. He's back in Europe, which was the scene of his just the destruction of his childhood and his family. So in many ways, he has no bearings.
No, that is an amazing first line. Amazing that you got that on the first try, because it really does set up, I think, a lot about him. And another comment is, what sort of stories interest you the most and the least, which we sort of talked about, but
that's hard for me to generalize. I definitely when I started writing, I had a couple of goals. One was I had a lot of music background, so I wanted to get music on the page. It was a challenge that I really cared about. But I always felt if somebody like found me in a dark alley and shined a light in my eyes, I would say, I'm interested in love and death. And so so I read a lot about love and death, and I write a lot about love and death. I'm extremely interested in grief and how people characterize grief, and the very poor job that we do in the United States of this like crazy expectation that you can get closure and bring grief counselors in, and 2 days later you'll feel all better. And also, I have been kind of overwhelmed by the outpouring of both fiction and nonfiction coming out of the Black community, contemporary Black writers who went out of print, who should not have gone out of print. It's this incredibly key part of American history that at least I, in a supposedly good public school, was deprived of growing up in a white neighborhood. So I read a huge amount about that. I'm really interested in genetically passed down trauma, which I think is endemic to the Jewish people. And I think many other peoples have it who have suffered, such as Black Americans. And I really care about language. So I love stories, but they have to be well written. I'm kind of picky about craft. So I really when the language is beautiful, I never can put a book down. But I'm a pretty ecumenical reader, and I read a lot of memoir as well.
No, that's amazing. Do you have any least, or do you want to focus on the positive?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that question?
Do you have any least stories that interest you the least, or do you want to keep it more positive?
No, I mean, I don't tend to read a lot of science fiction and fantasy. And I have to tell you, one of my daughters loves that, so she passes them along to me, and I'm like, oh, I really liked this. Maybe I should read more of this. But I don't tend to focus on that.
No, and we all have our genres where they're just not our first that come to mind. They're not what we reach for first.
Yes, yeah.
Yes, and also Barbara wanted to say thank you so much, Barbara. Congratulations on your debut novel. I'm looking forward to reading, which it is amazing. It's available. I believe it is out now, so definitely go to bookshop.org. We have a link right here. Feel free to buy it.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you so much. It was published yesterday, and I do want to say the audiobook was released on the same day. So it's now available in audio format, e-format, and print format, which is very exciting.
Yes. And generational trauma it's a fascinating thing. I know I've read a few books about that, the phenomena of it, not fiction books centering on it. Is that something that you feel also inspired Three Muses?
Yes. I think generational trauma is really important. I mean, it's very interesting to me because in my own family, on my mother's side, there were relatives who were lost in the Holocaust, and on my father's side, there were relatives who were murdered in the pogroms that took place in Ukraine. Um, I think my particular family members were murdered in 1905. There were major pogroms across Ukraine at that time, just people coming in and just murdering
Mhm.
whole Jewish towns. And the stories were, I would say, were not really talked about. They weren't ignored. It's not that I was surprised when I heard them later,
Mhm.
but it was really not a topic of conversation. And I think this is extremely typical in Jewish families where particularly the generations who remember the trauma do not want to talk about it. They want to be forward looking. And I guess my understanding, and I think our understanding, people who really study this, is that it gets into the kind of bone marrow of families. It's like children sense it, but they don't know why.
Mhm.
And I wrote a piece about the Ukrainian side of the family, and I had cousins who reached out to me and said, first of all, they had never heard the stories before. And second of all, they said, "Oh my God, this explains so much, why, all the
Mhm.
anxiety or whatever that I feel that's sort of unnamed." So I think we have to tell those stories, even if they are really painful. But I
Mhm.
also recognize it's very hard. It's re-traumatizing for some people to talk about it.
No, and that is, I think, in a way, it's amazing how books like The Three Muses, or just Three Muses, my apologies, Sitnota, um, have really, are hopefully enlightening maybe people who don't have that experience, but also maybe sharing that so some modern people can also sort of understand and hear those
Thank
stories.
you. I was very motivated by that. I mean, I mentioned earlier that we are reaching the point where we will no longer be able to speak with
Mm-hmm.
Holocaust survivors because it's a generation that's dying out. And it's very important to me to tell these stories forward, not only because of this massive crime, but also
Yes.
because unfortunately we see it all over the world today. And I think our own society is at tremendous risk right now if we allow bigotry and racism and prejudice to take over. We really, really risk something like this happening again. And to some extent, we have it in a low grade way. In our country, the way we're seeing school children being murdered, we're seeing Black kids getting murdered by cops. I mean, we have to be really careful. We've had murders of Muslims just because they practice Islam. This is very, very real, and we need
Mm-hmm.
to understand it.
No, and that is such an important part, and it's such an important thing to bring to light, which is why stories like yours and the Three Muses are so important. And I can't agree with you more that it's something everybody seriously needs to look at, and we need to look in our own lives how we can help push forward understanding and not push forward more bigotry. Even if we aren't aware of it, even if we don't know that's what we're doing, we need to always be listening. If somebody informs us of our behavior, we should just work on it and we should move forward with that. So I think, yeah, what you said is one of the most important things people can keep in mind right now, I think.
Thank you. And I think that we, particularly white people, have to
Mm-hmm.
be intentional about this. And it's a
Yes,
lifelong project. I'm going to always be learning,
absolutely.
I think.
No, and that's that always learning mindset, I think, is really also one of the most important things. We do have a few to shift. We do have a few more audience questions I want to make sure we get to. Caroline has one more that she loved Three Muses so much and wanted to ask, who or what are your muses?
Such a great question.
Mhm.
Well, I would say probably those three. My husband thinks I only ever write about discipline. I think I disagree. I'm really interested in discipline. And I think I've had to understand it pretty deeply as a writer because you write, at least in my experience, you write for a long time without anybody in the world wanting to read what you're writing. So there is some discipline involved in that. But I also have a deep music background, and I really most of my fiction work includes something about music. So I'm really, really motivated by music. And then I guess I want to say it's taken me a long time to understand this in terms of memory. I don't write autofiction, meaning these are completely fictional, made up stories, but I think memory gives me access to the emotions, the emotions of childhood, the emotions of adulthood. Those come from your memory and they can be real even if you fictionalize them on the page. So I think I would say all three, actually. I love that question.
And that's fantastic and definitely true about memory. I feel like we can only write from our point of view as authors, so we're always infusing a little bit of our memories into it, even if it's completely fictionalized.
Yes, exactly.
Right. And another question, I think our last one, is if it's not too late, do you have any advice for aspiring writers? From Remy Lady.
Thank you. I have a little bit of advice because I've been there for so long. Don't give up. I would practice, practice, practice. So keep at it. And I think it's important to remember that rejection is what's normal and acceptance is very rare for everybody. Rejection is what's normal. And I guess the last thing I would say is it's good to get feedback, but you have to really, really trust your reader. If you feel somebody's trashing you or saying something unfair, they're not your reader. I just want to give a really clear example of this, and that is that I had 2 senior editors in New York tell me that I needed to lose, I can't even say it without laughing. I needed to lose the 3 muses in this book. Could I please get rid of them? And I was like, no, that's what the book's about. So that's the kind of feedback that we probably should ignore.
No, I think it was maybe in our interview last week, we talked about that one of the worst mistakes you can make as a writer is listening to everyone's feedback and taking it all in, that you have to be careful, pick and choose.
Exactly.
No, that is, I can't imagine it would just be a different book if you did not have
a different writer. I think it would be a different writer.
That is amazing that they tried to strip away just like the identity of the novel.
Very funny, actually.
No, and it's great. I mean, it is great that you did not listen to that feedback.
Thanks.
But yes, as a final question, I wanted to ask, is there anything you did not get to talk about or that I did not ask about that you do want to talk about?
Well, I will just wrap up the last question by saying I'm going to be 65 next month, and I want to put that out in the world because it's never too late. And I do want to say to the audience, I'm really interested in bringing my book into your home. If you are in a book group and you want me to zoom in, I would be very thrilled about it. My website is the same as my name. And I want to really, really thank Caroline for making this possible. And I want to give a huge shout out to Bo. This is Bo's first on-air interview, and you've done a beautiful job. And I want to say thank you.
Thank you so much. You've been an amazing first interview for me, and I have loved every minute of it and loved listening to you. You are a fantastic writer.
Thank you.
But yes, thank you so much. Thank you to everyone tuning in. Don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe to us for more blazing goodness and more amazing authors like Martha here. And thank you all. We will see you next time.
Bye-bye.